I appreciate the prayer that was prayed a moment ago, and because he didn't say this phrase, he won't think I'm picking on him. He said, ready remembrance. But it made me think of what I hear a lot of folks say when they pray for the preacher. You know, ready recollection. I love my brethren because they are really good to let me know that they like me, because my mama says if they pick on you, they must like you. I'm liked a lot. And when I was getting ready to preach one Sunday, it was the holiday season several years ago at Bear Valley, there turned up in my box, my mailbox, somebody went to a lot of trouble. It was a flat cardboard with the little plastic. It had Hot Wheels. It had matchboxes in there, and they were crushed all different kinds of ways. And that anonymous person, to this day still anonymous, said, well, they're always praying about your ready wreck collection. And so I want you to have yours. And so I hope I have my ready wreck collection this afternoon, because the challenge is difficult. We've all eaten and are now settled in, and the blood is concentrating on doing its job, and I've got to do mine. There have been a lot of different studies made on the practice or the art of decision making. One of the most interesting to me was done by a retired Navy logistics engineer by the name of John Reese. And in his study, he said, do you know how many different ways that you can arrange 10 different books on a bookshelf? I didn't know anybody even cared about that, but he did a study. 3,628,800 different ways. You see, you can arrange the first book 10 different ways. The second book, 9 different ways. The third book, 8 different ways, and so on down the line. That's 10 factorial. 10 times 9 times 8 times 7 and so on. Now for you non-math types like me who may be getting ready to doze off at that kind of mathematics, I want to make application. There may not be 3.6 million different ways to choose how to live your life. But the implications of those decisions are so much more important than how you put books on a shelf. And though there aren't that many different ways, think about what it is that we've got to make decisions about. We've got to make decisions about our character. We've got to make decisions about God and about eternal salvation. Those have great ramifications. And so it matters how we approach those decisions that we make. When you think about decisions, we call our approach to those decisions in a broad sense a worldview. Our way of looking at the world and trying to make sense of all of the big why questions of life. There was a man by the name of John Godfrey Saxe, who was a 19th century American poet who borrowed an ancient Indian fable about 6 blind men who were shown an elephant and to try to describe what an elephant is like. And the one who stood next to the side said that an elephant must be like a wall. And the one who grabbed his tusk said that an elephant must be like a spear. And the one who had the trunk said an elephant must be like a snake. And the one who had the legs said an elephant must be like a tree. And the one who had the ear said an elephant must be like a fan. And the one who had the tail said it must be like a rope. And I like the way that John Godfrey Saxe ended that poem. And so the men of Indostan disputed loud and long, each in his own opinion, exceeding stiff and strong, though all were partly in the right and all were in the wrong. How you approach the big decisions of life matter. I want us to focus on someone in the Old Testament who lived in the midst of several different ways of looking at life. He was not bothered with some of the modern worldviews that we have, ways of looking at our world. And yet he did have those around him who looked at life a completely different way. And it impacted their destiny. In fact, it led them to destinies of shame and even destruction. As you look about those who are surrounding Samuel, there were the sons of Eli. And the Bible tells us that they did not fear God. And their sin was very great before the Lord. Hophni and Phinehas, in 1 Samuel 2, in verse 12, you can read about all the things that they had the audacity to do, and they had a view of the world that had no fear of God, and it caused them, even though they were full-time church workers, to do some incredulous stuff. And then there was Eli. He had a worldview as a parent. And he approached his parenting indulgently. And his decision, his view of life, cost him and his sons their lives, according to 1 Samuel chapter 3. And then there was Eli's daughter-in-law. You remember what happens to her? This is after the loss and battle to the Philistines. And as the result of this, the Ark of the Covenant's been stolen. And when Eli hears about that, the death of Hophni and Phinehas, he fell over backwards and broke his neck. About that time, she's about to give birth to a son. And she calls him Ichabod. Now that name doesn't mean much to us outside of a tale that we have read to us when we're children, but that name means the glory of the Lord has departed. Her view of the world was pessimistic. She saw these losses and she saw God's presence as it was symbolized in the Ark of the Covenant gone, and she said there's no more glory. And then there were the Philistines. The Philistines, they saw Jehovah God as just like all the other gods. And so in 1 Samuel chapter 4 and verse 8 and chapter 5 verse 6, it impacted their whole view of how they lived their life day by day. Do you remember the sons of Beth Shemesh? They saw the open door of the lid of the Ark of the Covenant, and they saw what was inside as a curious spectacle. And so they looked in there, and over 50,000 of them lost their lives. Here are individuals who should have known better, but they saw God as just a curiosity. And then in 1 Samuel 7 and verse 4, the view of the Israelites toward God was like the Baals and the Ashtaroth. You see, their decisions led them down the road toward their utter end. Whatever it was going to be, if they turned around, they could have certainly had a different destiny, but there were some who were set on a course based on their decisions. And in the middle of all of that, here is Samuel. Here is a young man. Here is a boy, a man, and an old man who in these various stages of life made the right decisions, and it determined his destiny. Now, if you grew up in Bible class, you probably remember the story of the extraordinary circumstances in which Samuel was born. You have Hannah, one of the two wives of Elkanah, Peninnah. She ragged her other wife so intensely, and as a result of that, Elkanah, though he loved Hannah more, was saddened at the fact that she was not able to conceive. And so she went in the year that we read about in 1 Samuel chapter 1, verse 10 and 11, and she prays bitterly that the Lord would grant the maidservant her request, and if He did, that she would give her son back to the Lord. And that's what happened. And so Samuel comes on the scene with that kind of a background, that kind of parenting, that legacy like we talked about this morning. But he was faced with decisions all of his life. And inasmuch as you and I are faced with decisions, we can learn a lot from him. I'd like you to notice three things from the life of Samuel. We're going to spend our time in the book of 1 Samuel today, and I want us to notice about Samuel these things. The first thing that we notice with regard to Samuel was the importance of the decisions that we make in our youth. How many of us have sang, "Remember not the sins of my youth"? You know, that's from Psalm chapter 25 and verse 7, where the writer of the psalm there is indicating that he wants God to forgive his sins and to not keep a record of the wrongdoings that he had done as a young person. You know, my grandfather's a very wise man, I was privileged to preach his funeral about 10 years ago. He was the E.F. Hutton of any room. When he spoke, people listened. And he often told me the old man has to live with what the young man does. And that stuck with me. I gave it credence because he was a cotton farmer in Mississippi and worked hard all of his life. From the day he died at 91, he was a 32 waist. And he was talking to me. I should have listened a little better, but he said, be careful about the eating decisions you make as a young person because it'll catch up with you. But you know, that's true about everything. The decisions that we make in the days of our youth are going to come around and have an impact on the later part of life that we live. I read about a few years ago a young man, or a man who was a youth minister of sorts in a religious group down in Florida. And he was trying to drive home the graphic point of the consequences of the sins that we commit in the days of youth. And to make that point, he got a .357 Magnum revolver and he loaded a blank cartridge in that. And he got up there and he began to preach, and he was spinning that revolving portion of the gun. And every once in a while he would fire that gun toward the ceiling to talk about that impact of how we take risks. And he went through that lesson, firing that gun. And toward the end of that lesson, just to really drive it home, he talked about the danger of never knowing when you're going to pull the trigger and something's going to happen. He meant to shoot at the ceiling, but he hit his skull. And the power and the force cracked his skull, and he died the next day. You know, he became a graphic illustration of the truth that he was trying to make for those young people. How many of us have known about the foolish and even sinful choices of someone that they made as a young person that cost them their life or did permanent physical damage? You know, we can do some silly things when we're young. I promise not to mention Cambodia every time that I get up and preach, but having just come back, I took Carl, my youngest son, with me. And I remember how all this started. I've taken all three of my sons over there. Our oldest son was with me in 2009. We went out to a village in Ling Dai, which is just outside of Siem Reap. And they caught a little mouse in the service, and a little girl, 4 or 5 years old, came up to me and showed me that. And I was impressed, first of all, the little girl would catch and not be afraid of a little mouse. But the preacher there said, they're going to eat that later. Well, we grimaced at that. And I had my oldest son, Gary, with me. He was 15 at the time. And the preacher said, well, what's wrong with that? He said, people eat mice and rats and snakes and all that all the time. Well, he and I ate a tarantula together and some crickets. Well, that started it. The middle son went and ate all kind of stuff. And my youngest son just went. And on the last night that we were there, he had a snake, he had a frog, he had a tarantula, and he had a roach. Yeah, I know. I said, I'm 44, I have nothing to prove. But he was 15 and had an older brother. And he was trying to prove that. The next day he woke up with a rash. And I thought, what is going on here? You know, making foolish decisions can really impact what happens next. But you know, Paul in 2 Timothy chapter 2 and verse 22 says, flee also youthful lusts. But sometimes when we're in the prime of our life, we say, well, I'm invincible. That's not going to happen to me. It's going to happen to somebody else. But as we think about what can happen, the decisions we make as a young person can impact the rest of our lives. I look at Samuel and the decisions that he made and how wise they were. As we begin to read about him, Samuel the boy, you see that he ministered before the Lord. 1 Samuel 2 and verse 21. That he grew before the Lord. That he grew in favor with the Lord and with men. 1 Samuel chapter 2 and verse 26. That he ministered unto the Lord before Eli. 1 Samuel chapter 3 and verse 1. That the Lord was with him and did not let one of his words fail. 1 Samuel chapter 3 verse 19. That the Lord confirmed him as a prophet. In 1 Samuel 3 and verse 20. And in 1 Samuel chapter 3 and verse 21 it says that the Lord appeared to Samuel at Shiloh by the word of the Lord. 1 Samuel 3 and verse 21. So you boil that all together. Samuel grew. Samuel ministered. Samuel was in favor with God and with men because of the decisions that he made as a young person. You know, the message of both the Testaments is to remember God when you're young. In Ecclesiastes 12 and verse 1, if you've ever been to a youth rally, you've heard this passage. Remember now your Creator in the days of your youth, while the evil days come not, and the years draw nigh, when you shall say, I have no pleasure in them. 1 Timothy 4 and verse 12 of the New Testament says, let no one look down on your youthfulness. And Paul praises Timothy because since childhood he had known the Holy Scriptures, which are able to make you wise unto salvation. 2 Timothy chapter 3 and verse 15. We're going to live with the decisions that we make. And you know, those who were surrounding Samuel, the influences in his life, like Eli and Hophni and Phinehas, they made decisions and it led to their shame and even to their death. But he made decisions that led him to prominence and to leadership. I was reading a study that was done in the fall of 2012. It was the study of sexual compulsivity and addiction journal. over 100 pages of research done by men who have all those letters after their names, who are in prestigious universities, who in the result of their study found that there was a peculiar impact that pornography, especially internet pornography, is making on adolescents. And when you get to the end of that very long study, the summary statement is this: that those who have been purveying internet pornography over the last 2 decades, it has led to them having an inability to connect socially with others. That it leads to immoral conduct. It leads to outrageous behavior, delinquent behavior. It leads to depressive symptoms. And it leads to a lack of bonding with caregivers. This is a timeless and graphic truth, that the decisions that we make in youth can mold and shape and determine our future. And that can mean, if we make those decisions poorly, that it has a difficult impact on us when we're older. But the opposite is also true. How many have made great choices in the days of youth, and as the result of that, it impacts their destiny as adults? Now, some of us did not obey the gospel until we were adults. But how many grew up in homes where their faith was impacted by godly parents and grandparents? And 2 Timothy chapter 1 and verse 5 says that Timothy was by Lois and Eunice. And how many have chosen a path of sexual purity and have reaped the rewards of that and avoided the heartaches that were suffered by those who followed their flesh and not faith? I have known a great many who made the decision in the days of their youth to have a certain outlook on life. That they were going to have a positive view of life. That they were going to have an unselfish servant heart. That they were going to choose honesty. They were going to choose hard work. And it shows in the person that they are as an adult. And such individuals have followed the example of Samuel when he was a boy. As we look at the decisions that Samuel made and how it determines his destiny, we see the importance of the decisions that we make as a young person. We're introduced to Samuel from the very beginning, before he's even born. And we see in that first important phase of life, what we call the formative years, he made the right decision, and it impacted his destiny. But second, I'd like you to notice, as we turn further into 1 Samuel, we see the importance of the decisions of a leader. You know, I've preached long enough now that I have seen some promising and wonderful young people. I think about a particular one or two that crossed my mind that were exemplary as young people. But something or someone, maybe a bad relationship or maybe a bad mentor, something influenced them, and now they're not faithful to God anymore. And I could have seen that coming because of the promise and because of the faith that they demonstrated. But Samuel does the exceptional here. He is a faithful child, and then when he rises to a place of prominence in his nation, he's still faithful to God. And he shows us how a leader thinks and what a leader does. I want you to see the particular positions that Samuel is put in and how he shows us how you lead. Samuel's decisions show him to be a leader. The first thing we learn from Samuel as a leader is how a leader looks and how a leader sounds. A leader urges faithfulness to God. In 1 Samuel chapter 7 and verse 3, you find Samuel pleading with Israel and saying to them that if you will serve the Lord God alone and you will leave the Baals and the Ashtaroth, then the Lord will deliver you from the hands of the Philistines. If you'll remember at this particular time that the people of God, they were drifting. Remember, they saw God as just like the Baal and the Ashtaroth. So here is Samuel who stands in the gap, and he says, look, you can't stay where you are. You've got to come back to the Lord God and you serve Him alone. And if you'll do that, then God will deliver you. That's the message of good leaders. God's leaders don't wet their fingers and stick it to the wind of popular opinion and say, well, whatever the will of the people is, that's what we'll do. Good leaders urge the people of God to be faithful. Even when it requires great courage of them, even when it's not what the will of the people want. Faithfulness. But second, Samuel shows us that a leader is a person of prayer. In 1 Samuel chapter 7 and verse 5, God shows us through the writer Samuel that Samuel calls all Israel to him and he says, come to me at Mizpah and I will pray for you. 1 Samuel 7 and verse 5. They wanted his prayers. In 1 Samuel chapter 7 and verse 8, the sons of Israel pleaded with Samuel not to cease crying to God on their behalf. I think you're like me. You want leaders who are people of prayer. Don't you want somebody that you think is godly praying on behalf of you, interceding? I think about a couple of people that I know who are people of mighty prayer. There's a man in our congregation who every morning gets up at 4 o'clock and he prays for every student in our school by name and their families. Prays for our elders, prays for our preachers, prays for all those that he has known and other places that he has lived in his life. I'm so thankful he's praying for me. You know, I think about my father. My dad has been a gospel preacher for 50 years, and I don't know that I have ever known a man who was a greater man of prayer than him. There have been several occasions my mom has told me that he has stayed up all night long, walking the floor in prayer. When I was 9 years old, I had a tumor on my liver. And the doctor went to Emory University in Atlanta, and they were certain that it was cancer. And they said, even if it's not cancer, he can't survive the surgery. And there were several nights where my dad didn't sleep as he was walking the floor in prayer. I don't know what God has spared me from. I don't know what God has allowed me to do because of the prayers of my father. But it certainly influences how I approach prayer on behalf of my own sons. We want people in our lives, don't we, that are praying for us? Have you ever thought about that? What blessings you are bringing into others' lives and what you're helping them avoid because of your faithful prayers? And of all the people there are, certainly, we want the prayers of our leaders. We want leaders who are people of prayer. In 1 Thessalonians 5 and verse 17, I want you to look at that passage and maybe look at it differently than you've looked at it before. Paul makes that simple, brief phrase, pray without ceasing. Now, it has been pointed out that this could be specifically spoken to leaders because Paul uses a petition verb, which was a very important cue to the Greek readers that what I'm about to say is very important. He has just used one in verse 12. I request, there's the petition verb, of you brethren. Now in verse 14 again, all of a sudden he says, I request of you. And he uses the word brethren. And if you look in 1 Thessalonians, every time Paul uses the word brethren, he's changing topics. If that's the case, would it not be, since he was already speaking to the whole church in verse 12, and based on what you see in verse 14 and following, that Paul is speaking specifically to elders when he says, I request of you brethren? If that's the case, he is urging elders to be people of prayer who are constantly in the mindset of prayer and who are thanking God. But even if not, even if, and certainly by application, this is for all Christians, how much we want our elders and our leaders to be men of prayer. We need their intercession. But he also shows us that a leader leads in worship. In 1 Samuel 7, 9, and 10, we see the burnt offering that Samuel gives, and he shows us how leaders are up front, are visible in worship, and they show their reverence, their interest, and their enthusiasm in their worship and their participation. But also he was a man of trust, and I love this. In 1 Samuel chapter 7 and verse 12, he gathers all of Israel. They're between Mizpah and Shin. He lays a rock in the ground and he calls it Ebenezer, and he says, thus far the Lord has helped us. I want you to think about that. What he's doing here is very symbolic. He takes that rock and he sets it down. And he says, all right, we've been to Mizpah. We're on our way to Shin. And now here's the mark in the ground. I want you to look from this rock backwards. Thus far, God has been with us. Confounded the Philistines, routed them, and here they are on their way. And what's the implication? If God's been with us so far, God's going to continue to be with us. God's leaders do not say, we are not able, Numbers 13:31. Instead, they say, God is able to do exceeding abundantly above all we ask or think, Ephesians chapter 3 and verse 20. Goals and vision and plans and spurring on good works are based on what God can do. And also good leaders are like Samuel in that they are among the people. 1 Samuel 7, verse 15 through 17. The rest of his life, Samuel goes judging the people of Israel, going from place to place in the nation. Do you notice that the leader was not isolated? He was among the people. Good leaders are not confining their leadership to decisions that they make in a room. They are among the people. Jesus is speaking about the characteristics of a good shepherd. And he says the sheep know their voice and go after them. They won't follow the voice of a stranger. They'll flee from them because they do not know the voice of a stranger. John chapter 10, verse 3 and 4. So as we look at Samuel, we see what a leader looks like and what a leader sounds like. But there's a warning there. And that is that leaders can be rejected. You remember what happens in Samuel's life? His boys aren't living right. It seems to be one of the failures, one of the few failures we read about in Samuel's life. He didn't learn from Eli's mistakes with Hophni and Phinehas, and so his own boys are not living righteously. So the people of Israel come to him and they say, your sons are not living right. And besides this, all the nations around us have a king. We want to be like them. And Samuel took that very personally. But he goes to God with this in 1 Samuel 8 and verse 7. And God says, they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me from being king over them. But he says, grant their request. But warn them that when they do this, it's going to present issues like taxation and pressing their family members into service. And Samuel valiantly warns them not to do this. But later on in 1 Samuel chapter 8, they say they would not heed the voice of Samuel. They said, no, we will have a king to be like the nations all around us. I want to speak to God's leaders here for a moment. Unless you are unique among all, you, if you've served as a leader, have known the sting of rejection. But look at the great company that you're in. Here was a man who was a wonderful servant of God, who was saying the right thing, and apparently in the right way. And in so many other situations, the people had wanted that leadership, but then when it was something that was for their good and they didn't recognize it, they rejected his leadership. If you're a leader, you know what rejection feels like. But don't be discouraged. Samuel did not give up. He continues to serve the Lord. Now let me speak to you if you have never been an elder, but you have followed elders. God tells us to honor our elders. In fact, Hebrews 13:17 uses a very strong word. It says, obey your leaders and submit to them. For they are those who give an account for your soul, that they may do so with joy and not with grief, for that would be unprofitable to you. Or what about in 1 Thessalonians 5, the passage we mentioned a moment ago in verse 12, when he says, I request of you, brethren, that you know those that work among you and labor over you in the Lord, and that you esteem them very highly in love for their work's sake. Elders have to make difficult decisions in the realm of judgment. Sometimes they may have to lead us to do something that's unpopular. May they never feel grief or heartache because of our attitude or because of our stubbornness. But as we look at Samuel, we see his decisions determined his destiny. Look at the decisions he made as a boy, and now he's in the prime of his life, and he's serving as God's last judge, his spokesman, before he turns the mantle over to the kings, and we see the great decisions that he made and how it determined his destiny. But then I want you to notice one last thing, and that is we see from Samuel the glory that comes in aging in and dying in the Lord. I want you to imagine being in Samuel's sandals, as it were. Here he is, he's been serving as God's primary spokesperson for all this time, and now it's passed on to the kings, and you're being asked to step aside. Samuel could have just decided to just get out of the Lord's work and retire. But I want you to see that he did some of his most important work in the golden years of his life. You know the things that Samuel did? First of all, Samuel appointed the first two kings of Israel, Saul and David. And he was the spiritual advisor to the first king that Israel ever had, Saul the Benjamite. And that wasn't an easy job, if you remember. Here was a guy who was full of self-will and disobedience and stubbornness eventually, and Samuel's having to deal with him. And finally it got so bad, God said, I'm taking the kingdom from him and I'm giving it to David. And so it was Samuel's job to go to him after the failure with the Amalekites. In 1 Samuel chapter 15 and verse 22, he says, does the Lord have as great delight in burnt offerings as in obeying the voice of the Lord? Behold, to obey is better than sacrifice, and to hearken than the fat of rams. Because you have not been obedient to the voice of the word of the Lord your God, He has rejected you from being king over Israel. 1 Samuel 15, 22 through 26. I don't know how you hear Samuel, but he's not being vindictive. He is not rubbing it in Saul's nose. He didn't want to do this. 1 Samuel 15 and verse 11 says he was distressed and he cried out to the Lord his God all night long. He was up in prayer all night. But then Samuel was appointed a prophet and a seer. In fact, he is known for this in other Bible periods of history. In Peter's second gospel sermon in Acts chapter 3 and verse 24, we see that he was the first one to speak clearly about Jesus coming as the Messiah in Acts 3:24. Paul calls him Samuel the prophet in Acts 13 and verse 20. And in the scripture that was read so well to us a moment ago by our brother, Hebrews 11 and verse 32, the Hebrews writer puts Samuel at the head of the class of prophets in faith's hall of fame. Samuel, from his lifetime on, is seen as a spiritual giant. The psalmist mentions him in Psalm 99 and verse 6. It says that Moses and Aaron, they served as priests before the Lord. And Samuel appeared before the Lord, and he heard them. In Jeremiah 15 and verse 1, Moses is coupled with another Old Testament character. It's Samuel. And Jeremiah says, though Moses and Samuel were to stand before me, I would not have my heart with this people. In the golden years of his life, as he's heading toward the winter time of life, here is Samuel still active and still working in the kingdom of our God. What can you do as a senior saint? If you are an older Christian, past the physical prime of life, is it time to hang up the armor and let somebody younger do it? I'm not saying you don't share the load, but isn't there something for you to do? I got a phone call last week after I got back, and it was from our patriarch in our congregation. I don't know if any of you are baseball fans, but his last name is Cale. His nephew was George Cale, the shortstop that played umpteen years ago and is in the Hall of Fame. Johnson is a remarkable man. And he called me. We have a devotional on Wednesday night. I'm sure you do too. And we call ours 90 Seconds of Power. The hint is, try to deliver us a message in about 90 seconds. And he called me and he said, I'd like to do the 90 Seconds of Power, the next opening you have. And I said, Johnson, you can have every opening we ever have. Whenever you want it, you can do it. 95. I would go hundreds of miles. I would, to hear Johnson Cale pray. Johnson Cale teaches our new converts class from time to time. Johnson Cale was responsible for starting a program about 5 years ago called Bear Valley Sings and Prays, where we come together on a night other than Sunday or Wednesday, and we get together and we sing and we pray about special things. Did I mention he's 95? In the prime of his life, actively serving the Lord. He wants Kathy and I to sit down with him next Monday and eat lunch with him. He's got a granddaughter who's-in-law who's not a member of the church, and he wants to strategize together on how he can get her in a Bible study. There's not time for us ever to retire from the Lord's army. There are limitations we begin to face when we're older that we didn't even think about when we were younger. Ecclesiastes 12, verse 2 through 7. But the Bible tells us that no matter what's happening to us outwardly, the inward man can be renewed day by day. While we look not at the things that are seen, which are temporary, but the things which are unseen, which are eternal. 2 Corinthians 4:16 and following. You see, we can remain active all the days of our lives. To me, it's a remarkable thing to study the life of Samuel. He started as a boy and was faithful. In the prime of his life, with all the pressures facing him, he was true to God. And all the way, in fact, Samuel was so valuable and important that Saul sought him after he was dead. 1 Samuel 28:11 and 12. He continued to be vital. But it seems to me that each decision he made led to the next place in life. May I encourage you that your tomorrows are being built by the decisions you make today. There's no greater decision you could make than to become God's child. No greater decision than to be enlisted in the Lord's army. Maybe you've not yet done that. It may have been that you came very close, you've come very close several times, and you're right at the edge, not ready yet to commit. What are you waiting for? What better thing could our Lord do than He did on the cross of Calvary for you? He's waiting for you to make the decision to follow Him, to show your belief in Jesus as the Son of God by repenting, by confessing that Jesus is the Son of God, and by being baptized to have those sins washed away, calling on the name of the Lord. You're ready to do that? We're ready to help you. If you're a child of God who knows that the decision that you're making is not leading you to the destiny that you want, you can change that. You can come back to Him at any time, and you know He's waiting for you. If you need to respond, why not do so right now as together we stand and sing this song.
There's a fountain
Free 'tis for you.